and it's ruining people's lives.
Except that, of course, the government had already toughened up strike legislation recently with the Trade Union Act last year, and those strikes did pass the required threshold. So what justification have you got to make it even harder?
Well, because I'm taking the RMT dispute in Southern as an example. There are around about 400 conductors, and you're quite right, a very high proportion, it was something like 75%, did vote for the strike action.
Right.
But you've got 300,000 people simply complaining about who opens and closes the door, preventing 300,000 people from getting to work on 40 days. That is not reasonable, it's not proportionate, and that's why change is needed. Look, I'm not saying strikes should be banned at all. I'm simply saying that we should balance the right to strike with the right of people to get to work and recognise those rights as well as recognising the right to strike.
Is the government supporting you on this?
Well, I'm not here to speak for the government. It's a private member's bill.
No, sure, but do you have their backing?
Well, I mean, the government will speak for themselves. It's not currently government policy. They are thinking about it very carefully. And of course, the more the unions behave unreasonably, the more likely this kind of legislation becomes, because we as MPs just can't sit back and watch our constituents have their lives ruined by this sort of action. So partly this is in the union's hands. If they behave reasonably, it makes the case for this kind of legislation weaker. If they behave unreasonably, it makes the case for this kind of legislation stronger.
What sort of turnout are you expecting from Tory backbenchers, from your colleagues?
Well, you know, after failing to predict both the Brexit referendum and also Donald Trump's election and also Ed Bull's unexpected success on Strictly Come Dancing, I am not in the prediction business. It does have a lot of backbench support. Over 50 Conservative MPs signed a letter to the Sunday Telegraph a couple of weeks ago, and there is widespread support here in Parliament, but more importantly in the country. Yesterday the Evening Standard published a poll showing that 55% of Londoners support these proposals, so public support as well as parliamentary support for these proposals is growing by the day.
All right, Chris Philp, we won't ask you for any more predictions then on that basis. Now, we're joined now by Mick Lynch of the RMT Union. Let's just go back to that poll in yesterday's Evening Standard that Chris Philp was talking about. Found that 55% of Londoners, as he said, want curbs on strikes by train drivers. It won't be good for you if you lose public support.
Well, that's a selective view of the poll. The poll actually showed that 61% of the country on the nationwide poll supported the right of train staff, emergency services staff, doctors, nurses, fire brigades, etc., to maintain their right to strike.
Yes, he's not taking away the right to strike, though, is he?
He's saying if you strike in the way I like and it's very ineffective, I'll tolerate your ability to strike. But this is a suppression of human rights, long-standing rights that trade unions and working class people have had.
And what about the rights of people to actually get to and from work?
Well, they have rights, and it's balanced by, if you like, in a very unfair way, by the current raft of legislation, which has just been completed through Parliament. It's not even fully enforced yet. We've got a whole raft of balloting laws and other laws that will restrict the right to strike coming in on March the 1st. And they've just been through a whole process of consulting and voting through Parliament. This is more about Chris Philp's ambitions, I think, and his career path from the backbenches to somewhere nearer the front. So he's getting a profile out of it. He's not done enough to bring about a resolution and put pressure on Chris Grayling and Southern to bring a resolution to this dispute. And he's politicising the dispute for his own ends and for the Tory party's agenda, which is whenever there's effective strike action, whenever the trade unions dare to put their heads above the parapet, they want to make what we do illegal and crush resistance to what they do in general.
Except he's not wanting to make it illegal, is he, in this sense? So let's just be clear. Do you support Chris Philp's bill?
Yes, generally. I will vote for it if there's a vote today.
Right. And in what circumstances would you deem a strike to be unreasonable on an essential service, as Chris Philp is describing here, the trains?
Well, Chris has set out that the critically essential services should have additional requirements before...
What would they be?
Well, I mean, it's going to be primarily transport, rail, perhaps for tubes, things which huge numbers of people depend on. I mean, Chris is speaking up, not only for his own constituents, but also all those travellers on Southern Rail who have been put through misery day after day.
And do you blame the company in any way?
Oh, I think the company is certainly open to criticism, but because this is a dispute between the company and the two trade unions.
So shouldn't some of your pressure be going on to the company?
Well, I mean, that's a matter... I know Chris Grayling is talking to the company as he's talking to the unions.
He's left it very late.
But he's done nothing in this dispute.
Well, no, Chris Grayling has said that his door is open, but this is about strike action and whether or not there are some services where there needs to be some protection for the consumers, the travellers in this case. And Chris has come up with one or two suggestions as to what kind of protection might be put in place.
But what you mean is, whenever strike action is effective, and we have to take on employers and challenge what they're doing in regards to safety or paying conditions or other rights that people have built up over many years, you find that to be too much and you'll challenge it and get one of your friends in the judiciary to make that strike illegal, which is happening all the time anyway.
At the moment, they haven't done very well with their friends in the judiciary so far.
Today
Well,
is not the day to say we have friends on the judiciary.
But there are always people that are willing to put the trade unions down. Nobody ever wants to give us the freedom that are enjoyed in other countries. We have the most repressive laws in the Western world.
Well, actually,
about the ability to
some of
strike.
the proposals that Chris has in his bill are mirroring what is already in place in other countries.
Other restrictive practices.
Yeah, but these are things where
you're not
other countries have said that you need
other countries where people are more free to take action. You know, you always find a country that's got a more repressive law
these are places
than the one
like
you're bringing
America,
in.
like Australia. They are developed Western economies, but they recognise that on critical services,
but
you
you
need
have the
some
power to deal with
protection.
Southern, and you choose not to. You choose to back them up. The DfT has put these people through all this misery as well. There was no need for this dispute in the first place. The DfT has sponsored this dispute from the beginning to get rid of guards on the trains. It's a political dispute in the sense that your party and your government is running it.
Do you accept that both sides have politicised it, that you have politicised it on the one side? I have before quoted to you the RMT president. You said it was quoted out of context, but it was broadly about taking down a Tory government when it came to resisting strike action. And you blamed the Tory government for ideologically opposing these strikes and not doing enough about the company. So politics has dogged this strike on both sides.
All strikes have a political element. There's going to be something in there that's a broader agenda than the thing that's right in front of you.
Agenda.
Well, the broader agenda is that the Tory party and the DfT want to dehumanise the railway. They want to take costs out of the railway, and they're going to change the franchises so that the companies can make more profit. And their ambition is to get rid of all guards on all trains in the UK.
Is that your ambition?
Well, it's a matter for the operating
company. It's in the franchises.
We've made clear that this is a dispute between the operating company and the unions.
It's a condition of the franchise.
It is the case, but actually across the rest of the country there are large numbers of trains that are driver-only operated without any difficulty whatsoever.
I suppose what I could say in terms of the legislation itself, this trade union legislation was brought in relatively recently. If you are supportive of toughening up or going further with that legislation, you obviously got it wrong the first time round.
Well, no, I mean, what Chris is introducing a private member's bill today, that's not going to become law. What he's doing is putting suggestions on the table. I think they're interesting ones. I think they're certainly worth looking at, particularly given the experience we've had in these last few weeks.
So will the government move on it then?
Well, that's a matter for the government, but I think...
Should they?
Yes, I would hope that these are sensible suggestions which are worth looking at.
You're revisiting a piece of legislation that you have only just brought in.
I think what is driving Chris Philp and a lot of other people is the fact that 300,000 people are being put through hell over a arcane dispute between two trade unions over who opens the doors of trade.
The dispute is not arcane. Yesterday there were two guards evacuating trains on the line, one due to fog and one due to a fire on a train. Nothing to do with opening and closing doors, by the way. We are passionate about defending the standards of safety on the railway. You choose not to believe that, but the guard has other roles besides opening and closing doors. That's what this dispute is about. And whenever we put forward reasonable industrial action that is effective, you seek to make it illegal. The Tory party has never brought in legislation that's going to assist trade unions. You've always been about oppressing our rights. And this is another chapter in that. And it's another chapter in suppressing people's freedom and the ability to resist what this government is doing and what the employers are doing.
The government says it's about balancing, or actually Chris Philp, I should say, says it's about balancing rights between the people who use the services and people like you who work in the services. But could this strike action actually backfire for the unions if it results in the government backing even tougher legislation that you see as anti-union?
Joe, in other words, whenever somebody tries to bully you, you give in and adopt their agenda. You come out with your hands up.
What will you do?
Well, we're not prepared to do that. We have the right.
What can you do?
We have the right to mount industrial action, and we will continue to do so. We always try to do that within the law, as we do with everything else, the other regulations about tax, about returns and all the rest of it, certification officer. We will continue to act within the law until the Tories make that impossible.
Wouldn't it be better to try and have a reconciliation rather than talking about tougher legislation that is only going to escalate this row? Because we've just heard they're just going to continue, the unions, which is within their right, further strike action.
Well, one of the suggestions in Chris Philp's bill is on essential services, where there is an industrial dispute, there should be a requirement to go to arbitration. That's one possibility. Another is that it should go before perhaps a judge, not a friendly one, as we've seen today, but an independent judge who can rule as to whether or not the action taken is proportionate. These are suggestions at this stage. This is not going to become law, but I think they are sensible and worth looking at.
Mick Lynch, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Now, Donald Trump promised yesterday to cut business regulation massively in the US. Could the UK government do the same here? That's the hope of many of those who campaigned for Britain to leave the EU. They say red tape associated with our membership of the EU is costing the UK economy billions of pounds every year. But what are Theresa May's plans? Here's Ellie.
EU regulations, one of the burning issues of the referendum campaign.
It is absurd that we are told that you cannot sell bananas in bunches of more than 2 or 3 bananas. If we take back control, we will lift the burden, £600 million a week lifted off the backs of British industry.
Bananas' claims about wonky fruit aside, saving all that money by getting rid of red tape is surely a persuasive argument. In 2014, the think tank Open Europe costed the impact of the 100 most expensive EU regulations on the British economy at £33.3 billion a year. Take environmental legislation, such as the UK Renewable Energy Strategy, costing a yearly £4.7 billion, it's one of the hottest figures on the list. Or employment legislation, such as the Working Time Directive, that was said to cost business £4.2 billion a year. And there's an annual price tag of £2.1 billion for the Temporary Agency Workers Directive.
Lots and lots of regulations that are very much to do with bureaucracy rather than real benefit. And that bureaucracy costs businesses money, especially when it's applied to every single business in the UK. You tot it all up, it's a huge cost. The British Chambers, for example, stopped measuring it in 2010 because nobody was listening, and by that point they'd already estimated that European regulations cost £80 billion a year.
Big numbers, but the government holds its hands up and says it likes many of these regulations. And anyway, it realises it could get its fingers burnt by removing them.
Under my leadership, not only will the government protect the rights of workers set out in European legislation, we will build on them. Because under this Conservative government, we will make sure legal protection for workers keeps pace with the changing labour market.
The think tank Open Europe reckon there's an annual £13 billion saving to be had from deregulation, but that would come from amending EU rules rather than dumping them completely. And it won't happen straight away.
Well, the government's plan is to take EU regulation onto the UK statute book, and the first instance is to keep that regulation the same in terms of negotiations with the EU, but clearly the government is giving itself the tools to look at that regulation in the future because it will be something that comes under parliamentary control. And I certainly think that as the relationship with the EU develops, as we're outside of the European Union, it's inevitable that in some areas regulation is going to diverge as we take different attitudes to certain issues and as the EU takes different attitudes which we might no longer sign up to.
Those hoping for a bonfire of EU regulations the day after Brexit might want to dampen their expectations. Changing the rules or getting rid of them completely, even if you wanted to, could well be a slow burn.
You enjoyed that, John Whittingdale. I suppose you would think one of the great advantages of Brexit is that we'll be able to abolish vast swathes of European regulation. So which EU law or regulation would you like to get rid of first?
Well, I think there's a lot to choose from, but what we've said to British business is you tell us which are the most burdensome, the most unnecessary pieces of regulation, and we will then look at whether or not those can be repealed. But this is going to take time. It's not part of the Brexit negotiations, because what we're going to do is introduce a bill which transfers all the European regulations into British law, and then we will have the opportunity to go through them and decide which are appropriate and which are not.
Right, but what are the regulations that you'd like to get rid of? I mean, we heard Boris Johnson saying we can get rid of so much of the pointless rules and regulations that are holding back this country. What did he have in mind?
Well, I mean, I think you've just had a list put up on the screen of some of those.
Okay.
Things like the Working Time Directive. Now, not necessarily to remove entirely. Part of the problem with the European regulation is that they are agreed in Brussels as a single regulation across the whole of Europe. What we will now be able to do is to look at it and design it so that it meets our specific needs. It might be that certain sectors should be exempted, for instance, from a Working Time Directive, but we have the time to look at these things and craft them so that they don't impose unnecessary costs and burdens on business.
But you'd like to restrict something like the Working Time Directive, which is at a cost of £4.2 billion. You'd like to limit some of the employment legislation that we have in place.
Well, that is an area where we can say to the various sectors, maybe the farming sector or the NHS or others who have complained about the impact of the Working Time Directive, you tell us what is now necessary, and which is unnecessary and just adding to our costs. And then the British government can draw up the regulation specifically designed for the needs of that particular sector.
But that puts you at odds with the Prime Minister, because Theresa May wants to enhance exactly that type of employment protection and legislation. A fairer Britain, she says, is a country that protects and enhances the rights people have at work. So she doesn't want to do that.
Well, no, we don't want to sweep away all workers' rights. And workers' rights were in place.
But you've just said
long
that business
before the
tells
European
you we
Union.
want to get rid